Staff Sergeant Robert Hayes leaned over the metallic briefing table inside the dimly lit operations room, his calloused fingers dragging across a series of satellite photos that showed a remote Afghan valley, a place the locals whispered about and called the Devil's Playground. The name alone was enough to send a chill into the stomach of any man who had spent years fighting in these mountains. The intelligence reports spoke of opportunity. A high-ranking insurgent leader moving weapons through a half-abandoned village nestled between razor-sharp peaks. But Robert felt something in his gut that told him this mission was not what it appeared to be. The room was filled with the low hum of fluorescent lights, the smell of coffee clinging to the air. Lieutenant Michael Rodriguez, their team leader, stood across from Robert. Scanning the same images, he noticed the tension in Robert's brow and asked what troubled him. Robert gestured at faint tire marks in the dirt roads that ran like veins through the ghostly village. Intel claimed the village had been silent for 2 weeks. Yet these tracks looked fresh, perhaps only 3 days old. Worse still, the thermal scans showed heat signatures glowing in buildings that were supposed to be abandoned. The details were faint, but Robert had learned to trust his instincts through 3 brutal tours, and each scar on his body was a reminder that ignoring instinct could mean death. The others shifted uneasily. Emma Williams, the radio operator, Jackson, the medic, Thompson, the rifleman, and Martinez, their explosives expert. They had all seen Robert's predictions come true before. On their last mission, his so-called paranoia had saved the entire squad from an IED that could have torn them apart. Silence filled the room until Captain John Morrison entered with his steady stride and weary eyes. He carried more than just folders. He carried the weight of endless decisions. He placed steaming coffee beside him and told the team that the mission had to be carried out within 48 hours. The target would vanish beyond their reach if they delayed. Higher command was watching this closely, and this was more than just an operation. It was a test of the effectiveness of small units in this changing war. Robert felt the burden of truth pressing against his ribs. He knew the village might be bait, a carefully laid trap to draw them in. He looked at the captain and said, "Perhaps this is what they want us to believe. Perhaps our intelligence has already been turned against us." The captain paused, his jaw tightening, then told Robert that this was exactly why he was being sent, to adapt and survive whatever they faced. The decision was final. There would be no turning back. Half an hour later, the thundering blades of the helicopter chopped through the night sky, carrying them deeper into the heart of the mountains. Robert sat pressed against the window, his night vision goggles turning the ridges and valleys into a ghostly alien landscape. The ground below seemed to claw toward the heavens, jagged stone like the teeth of some ancient beast. The rhythm of the rotors beat against his chest, steady and unrelenting. He touched the stock of his rifle and whispered in old prayer taught by his grandmother, words that carried the weight of countless generations, words that asked for protection when reason failed. The pilot's voice cut through the headsets. 5 minutes to landing zone. Weather stable, but strange radio chatter is breaking through. Michael asked him to explain, and the pilot said multiple frequencies, coordinated transmissions, none of which matched their intel. Robert felt his stomach sink. Coordinated signals meant organized resistance, and organized resistance meant that the quiet valley below was no graveyard. It was a hunting ground. Robert locked eyes with Emma across the cramped cabin. Her expression mirrored his fear. She was already tightening her grip on the radio unit as though expecting it to shatter in her hands. Suddenly, the helicopter jerked violently to the left. Tracer fire slashed the darkness. Red streaks of light tearing through the sky like angry fireflies. The pilot screamed that they were taking fire. The supposed safe landing zone below erupting in bursts of muzzle flash. The bird shuddered as rounds tore. Through its side, sparks spraying as wires burned. Martinez cried out as his ankle twisted against a support beam during the chaos. The pilot yelled that the zone was compromised. 15 to 20 shooters waiting like wolves in the dark. He said he could not make it to his secondary landing site. The tail rotor was failing. He had to put the bird down now, or they would all be dead. The helicopter dropped like a stone, slamming into the earth with bone rattling force. It bounced once, twice, before sliding to a halt in a choking storm of dust and debris. Silence followed, broken only by the ringing in their ears and the frantic shouts of the lieutenant calling for everyone to sound off. One by one voices answered, bruised but alive. Martinez cursing about his ankle. Emma holding her bleeding radio unit, but insisting she could fix it. Jackson and Thompson shaken, yet unbroken. Hayes himself battered but furious. He kicked open the cabin door and scanned the ridge lines with his scope, already spotting the enemy movements. They were not safe, not for a single breath. The radio crackled with voices, but not the familiar cadence of command. These were enemy fighters speaking in Pashto, their words filled with eagerness as they coordinated hunting parties. They knew exactly where the bird had gone down. They were moving to surround them. The Devil's Playground had claimed their presence, and the Devil himself was already on the way. The Blackhawk rested broken in the valley floor like a wounded animal, its metallic frame groaning under its own weight as the team spilled into the night air. The dust cloud had not even settled when Robert raised his rifle and swept the ridge lines. His heart thudded in rhythm with the dying thrum of the rotors. The air smelled of burned wiring and hydraulic fluid, a bitter mix that clung to their throats. Lieutenant Michael steadied himself against the twisted cabin wall. His face pale, yet determined. He asked for a status check, and the voices came back like a roll call of survival. Martinez swore about his ankle, yet insisted he could still fight. Emma clutched her cracked radio, shards of plastic glinting against her bloodied face. She was already fiddling with its guts, trying to coax life back into it. Jackson the medic gripped his pack tighter, his eyes scanning everyone for wounds he would need to tend. Thompson and Hayes answered steady, their rifles already raised toward the shifting shadows. Then came the sound that froze them all. Enemy chatter crawling across the damaged radio like a whisper from the grave. Pashto voices crisp and confident. They spoke of search patterns, encirclement, hunting teams. They knew the crash site. They were converging from multiple directions. Robert felt the weight of inevitability pressing against his chest. They were in the Devil's Playground, and the enemy was closing the gates. Michael asked how long until first light. Jackson glanced at his watch and whispered 4 hours. For long hours in open ground with a limping man and a broken radio. Robert scanned the terrain again. Rocks rising like jagged teeth, valleys curling into deep shadows. Nowhere to hide. He turned to his commander. We are not holding this ground. We move, and we move now. The team pushed north, leaving the shattered bird behind, each step crunching against gravel that sounded too loud in the oppressive silence. Martinez favored his right leg, but pressed on, gritting his teeth against the pain. Emma carried her ruined radio like a child she refused to abandon. Jackson kept glancing at Michael, whose wound was wrapped but bleeding still. The night pressed heavy upon them. The stars brilliant above, but the earth below crawling with unseen predators. 200 meters in, Thompson's voice hissed through the throat mic. Movement 2 o'clock. Instantly the squad froze. Robert swung his scope toward the slope. At first nothing, then a glint of starlight kissing metal. Someone was watching them. Robert whispered, I see. It could be a spotter. Michael winced from the pain, yet commanded forward movement. There was no choice. Stopping meant death. They had not gone far before the silence exploded. Gunfire erupted from the ridges. AK rounds slicing through the air, sparking against rock, kicking up geysers of dust. Robert dived behind a boulder as fire erupted in disciplined bursts from 8 or more positions. The enemy had been waiting. Their muzzle flashes lit the night like lightning storms. Contact front, Robert shouted, his voice steady against the chaos. He returned fire, precise and mechanical, cataloging each flash, marking positions with the cold clarity of survival. Behind him, Lieutenant Michael stumbled. A bullet tearing into his shoulder, he collapsed into a shallow depression with a grunt of agony. Hayes shouted the lieutenant his hit. Jackson was instantly there, ripping open his kit, hands already slick with blood. Hayes and Thompson laid down, suppressing fire. But it was clear this was no random skirmish. The enemy had prepared the ground with spider holes invisible in the satellite photos. This was a kill zone. Robert knew it in his bones. He barked to Emma, get the radio working. We need air. Emma dragged herself behind a jagged rock, sparks dancing as another burst struck too close. She screamed into the handset, Mayday, Mayday. Our grid. 6 men, 1 wounded. Immediate extraction. Before the words were finished, a round punched through the set, shards ripping into her face. She fell back bleeding. Jackson shouted the radio is gone. She is hit but still conscious. The realization hit them like ice water. They were cut off, alone, hunted. The enemy pressed forward, their fire not wild but precise, forcing the squad into a shrinking pocket. Hayes noticed the pattern. The rounds came not to overwhelm but to steer. He shouted to Michael, "They're not trying to finish us here. They are funneling us toward the village." He felt dread spreading like poison. The village was not refuge. It was the killing ground. The stone wall they crouched behind cracked under the relentless barrage, chunks splintering and showering them with sharp fragments. Robert pressed against it, feeling each impact reverberate through his bones. The lieutenant called for ammo check. Hayes answered 3 magazines. Thompson 2. Martinez cursed as his rifle jammed again. Robert checked his own load. 5 mags, 150 rounds at best. Against dozens of fighters, this was nothing but sand against a storm. Williams clutched her bleeding face and whispered through trembling lips that backup chatter revealed more fighters moving in. 2 more squads. Maybe more. Robert listened to the footsteps growing closer, the shouts in the distance, the rattle of vehicles. They were closing the net like wolves on prey. The lieutenant's breathing grew shallow, his skin pale. Jackson whispered he needed real medical help now, or he would bleed out. The team had minutes, maybe less. The sound of engines echoed from the north, reinforcements rolling in, dust clouds rising into the starlit sky. Robert peered through a crack in the crumbling wall. He saw the enemy advancing with confidence, their leader marked by a red headband, barking orders, his men moving like hunters, tightening the noose. 30 seconds, and they would be close enough to rain grenades over the wall. Robert steadied his rifle, preparing to make his last shots count. His finger tightened, but then something unexpected ripped through the valley. A single crack, louder than the storm of AK fire. A Taliban fighter pitched backward, his head snapping as blood sprayed across the rocks. Confusion rippled through their ranks. Another crack, another man dropped. The shots came from the ridges from impossible angles, precise and merciless. The enemy faltered, searching the mountains for the phantom shooter. Robert scanned through his scope, but could not locate the source. Whoever it was moved like a ghost, firing from places no man could reach so quickly. Then another voice broke through the backup radio, accented, strained, yet clear. "American soldiers, you are in great danger. I am friend. Trust me." Robert froze. His team stared wide-eyed, between life and death. A stranger had just claimed the role of savior. The night valley held its breath as the mysterious shots echoed across the ridges. Robert pressed his cheek to the stock of his rifle, searching for the source, yet the phantom refused to reveal himself. A third enemy collapsed mid-stride, his body crumpling into the dust with a spray of earth rising behind him. Whoever was firing moved with impossible speed, shifting angles and ranges with the knowledge of a man who owned the mountains. The radio hissed again, the same voice calm as stone under pressure. "American soldiers, listen carefully. Enemy fighters behind large rock at your 2 o'clock. He prepares grenade." Robert turned sharply, his scope catching the glint of metal, a figure pulling the pin from a battered Soviet grenade. Before he could adjust, a crack rang out. The fighter dropped, the grenade tumbling harmlessly into the dirt. Emma's backup unit crackled once more, the stranger's voice returning. "You have little time. More enemy squads advance from the north road. I will guide you. Move south toward stone formation 50 meters. There is cover." The squad exchanged glances, their faces pale green in the glow of their night gear. Suspicion warred with desperation. Hayes whispered into the mic. "Who are you?" The voice answered after a pause. "I have lived in these mountains for many weeks. The men who hunt you also hunt me. Tonight we share the same enemy." Another shot cracked the silence. A flanking enemy dropped before he could raise his rifle. Robert's chest tightened. Whoever this was had them in his sights all along and had chosen to protect rather than destroy. The voice came again. "When I fire again, move quickly. You will have only seconds." Then thunder split the ridgeline, rapid shots forcing the enemy into cover. Robert shouted, "Move, move." The squad bolted from the crumbling wall, dragging Michael between them, their boots pounding against stone as they raced toward the indicated cover. The stone formation swallowed them, jagged rocks shielding them from at least some angles of fire. They collapsed into the shadows, gasping. Emma clutching her damaged radio. Martinez limping badly. Jackson pressing harder against the lieutenants. Wound. Robert peeked through a narrow gap. He saw new trucks arriving from the north, dust clouds curling around them. Fighters spilled from the vehicles with the discipline of veterans. These were not frightened recruits. They moved like men who had survived too many battles. And then he saw their commander, an older man with a gray-streaked beard moving with deliberate authority. Robert recognized the type instantly, a survivor of earlier wars. A soldier who knew every inch of mountain combat. The radio crackled again, the voice more tense now. American soldiers, the new commander is dangerous. He knows the mountains. He will find me. Robert felt a chill. For the first time, the phantom sounded uncertain. Through his scope, Robert saw the gray, bearded commander deploying his men in a grid, methodical, precise, searching every cave and crevice. Counter-sniper tactics, Hayes muttered under his breath. He knew they were not just facing hunters now. They were being stalked by a master. Silence fell on the radio. No further instructions, no guiding voice. Their unseen ally was either on the move or under fire himself. Robert's gut twisted with unease. Without that guardian, they were cornered animals. Martinez covered the rear despite his twisted ankle, his rifle steady. He whispered to Robert, "Movement behind us, too. They're closing both ends." Jackson shook his head grimly over Michael, who drifted in and out of consciousness. He whispered he needs a hospital soon, or he is gone. Robert studied the terrain, the encroaching enemies, the failing light of the stars above. The team had perhaps 1 hour before total collapse. Their ammunition was down to scraps, maybe 60 rounds across them all. Robert's mind screamed for an answer, yet every option ended in death. Finally, he made his decision. He told them he was going hunting. The others turned with disbelief. Thompson snapped that it was suicide, 30 men out there, but Robert said they were all focused on the ridges. None would expect a lone predator moving from below. The lieutenant's hand, weak with blood loss, grabbed Robert's wrist. Voice rough. "Robert, do not. We stick together." But Robert met his commander's eyes. "This is the only way. If I can disrupt them, if I can take their leader, maybe we survive." Jackson muttered this was madness even for him. But Robert had already studied the shadows, the gullies, the cracks in coverage. He knew there were blind spots. He looked at his brothers in arms, told them if he did not return, they must hold until dark, then try for the extraction point. If the ghosts contact you, tell him I have gone hunting. He might understand. With that, Robert slipped into the darkness, his rifle steady, his breaths measured. He moved like a shade through stone and dust, crawling low through gullies, keeping ridges between him and the hunters. The night air tasted of iron and smoke, each scrape of his knee against rock echoing in his mind like a thunderclap. Then he saw it, a body sprawled behind a boulder, an enemy fighter, but the man was already dead, a bullet through his head, clean and efficient, the blood still warm, the ground wet. Robert's pulse quickened. Their phantom ally had been here. A faint blood trail led away from the corpse, droplets spattered against stone, not from the dead man, but from someone else. He followed the trail until he reached a narrow cave mouth hidden by scrub. Inside came the faint sound of controlled breathing. Someone trying to mask pain. Robert leveled his rifle, whispered low, "I know you are in there. I am the American sniper. Are you the one helping us?" A silence stretched. Then came a voice from within, gravelly and burdened with years. "American soldier, you should not have come. You have made yourself a target." Robert stepped into the cave, his eyes adjusting to darkness. His rifle never lowered. In the shadows sat an old Afghan man, his face carved by decades of hardship, his hands reloading an ancient rifle with calm precision, his left leg wrapped in blood-soaked cloth. On the wall behind him hung maps, notes, and photographs marked with crosses. It looked less like a hideout and more like the shrine of a hunter. Robert felt his breath catch. This was no coincidence. This old man was the ghost of the mountains, and tonight their survival rested in his scarred hands. The cave smelled of dust and gun oil, its walls scarred with the marks of old fires. Robert lowered his rifle slightly, though his muscles stayed coiled. The old Afghan sat like a statue of stone, his weathered face carrying both wisdom and unhealed grief. His eyes shone in the faint light as he slid around into the chamber of his Dragunov rifle. He did not move with the fumbling of age, but with the steady rhythm of a man who had done this 1,000 times. Robert crouched beside him, seeing the bandage wrapped around his leg dark with fresh blood. Yet the man's breathing stayed calm. He had the discipline of a soldier and the patience of a predator. Robert's gaze drifted across the cave walls where maps and photographs were pinned. Red strings connected images of fighters, patrol schedules, and personal details. Some faces were marked with bold crosses, others circled. This was not revenge and blind fury. This was a campaign, precise and deliberate. The old man's voice came again, steady though touched with sorrow. My name is Khalid. I was once a teacher, mathematics, science, a man of classrooms, but war erased my chalkboard and placed a rifle in my hands. Robert listened in silence as the man spoke of his son Rashid and his daughter-in-law Fatima, of how they had taught children in secret, of how the Taliban had dragged them into the village square at dawn. The memory hardened Khalid's eyes as he described how they were executed while he was forced to watch. His voice did not tremble. It was steel, but the grief was carved deep into every word. Robert understood then. The ghost of the mountains was not born of legend, but of loss. For 93 days Khalid had hunted, killing 17 men tied to the massacre of his family. He knew each face, each weakness, and 6 still remained, including their gray, bearded commander, the one who had given the order that morning. Outside the cave, the voices of the search teams grew louder. Robert tensed, scanning the entrance. Khalid simply shifted his weight and gestured toward a passage at the back. He whispered that these caves stretched for kilometers, carved by rivers and used in wars long past. He had mapped them all. He knew every shadow, every exit. The enemy thought they were closing in, but Khalid said they were the ones being hunted. Robert checked his rifle and turned back. If we fight together, it is my way. Clean shots. No torture. When this is over, your commander becomes a prisoner. Khalid's gaze darkened. He spoke of justice and revenge, of wanting the man alive to understand loss. Robert's jaw tightened. He told him mercy was not weakness. Mercy was what separated them from the men who burned schools and shot teachers. For a long moment, Khalid's face was unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. Very well, American. But if your mercy allows him to kill again, his blood will be on you. They sealed the pact with a firm grip of hands. Then Khalid rose with surprising strength despite his wound. His movements were ghost-like as he led Robert through the narrow passage. Their shoulders scraped limestone worn smooth by centuries of hidden water. They crawled, crouched, and crept through twisting veins of the mountain, emerging at last onto a ledge that overlooked the valley from behind. The Taliban fighters spread below like ants across the dust, searching, sweeping, unaware that the hunters now stood behind them. Khalid pointed out the men, his voice a low growl. He knew each one. The man with the red headband had struck his son first. The man near the dead tree was half-deaf on his left side. The one crouched by the ruined wall stole from the villagers' food stores. Robert listened, absorbing the details. He realized Khalid did not just kill. He studied, dissected, understood. This was vengeance mixed with intelligence. The 2 men moved like shadows, one with modern gear and training, the other with the cunning of decades of survival. Their first kill was silent, Khalid's knife sliding between ribs, the fighter slumping wordless into the sand. The second fell to Robert's suppressed pistol, a clean headshot. The knights swallowed their movements. By the time the enemy realized bodies were missing, 6 men had already vanished, their lifeblood seeping into the dust. Fear spread among the enemy ranks. Shouts rang out, their commander's voice growing sharper as he tried to hold discipline. Robert heard him call for reports, fighters stammering as they admitted to lost positions. It was the same dread Robert had felt minutes earlier, now reversed. Now the hunters had become the prey. Robert and Khalid melted back into the cave tunnels, shifting positions, reappearing elsewhere. Each strike came from a new direction, each bullet precise, each death another whisper to the night that justice was not far. Khalid whispered in Robert's ear that now they would escalate. Phase 2. Time to get loud. At dawn, the valley was painted in crimson light. The remaining Taliban had clustered into a defensive circle, their nerves frayed, Mullah Hakim, the gray-bearded commander, barked orders, his voice edged with desperation. 12 fighters still obeyed him. 12 against shadows they could not see. Robert and Khalid positioned themselves at opposite ridges, scopes glinting in the morning sun. Robert's voice came over the captured radio, steady as command. On my mark, 3, 2, 1, execute. Their rifles thundered in unison, precision fire crossing the valley from east and west. 2 fighters fell instantly. The circle splintered. Khalid's eyes burned with the fury of his vow. Robert's hands moved with the cold rhythm of duty. This was no longer simply survival. This was the final act of 2 hunters, one born of war, the other forged by grief, and together they would write the last chapter of the Devil's Playground in blood and fire. The sun lifted higher, spilling red light across the jagged peaks, as though the mountains themselves bled. Smoke and dust curled from the battlefield below, where the last circle of fighters clung to their positions. Mullah Hakim barked commands, his gray beard bristling, his voice sharp with anger, but beneath the sound Robert heard the cracks of fear. This was no longer the confident predator who had orchestrated the ambush. This was a cornered beast fighting to delay the inevitable. Robert and Khalid traded fire from opposite ridges, their rifles spitting death in a cruel rhythm. One after another fighters dropped, collapsing behind rocks or falling into the dust. Yet these survivors were not green recruits. They fought with the desperation of men who had seen too many battles. They returned fire with discipline, their bullets chipping stone from the ledges where Robert crouched, each impact spraying shards into his face, forcing him to shift constantly from cover to cover. Khalid's voice crackled in the radio they had taken from a dead fighter. American, they are trying for the vehicles. If they reach the radio, they will call reinforcements. Robert swept his scope and spotted 4 men sprinting low toward the battered trucks. One clambered onto the mounted machine gun, already unleashing a storm of heavy rounds. Robert squeezed the trigger, and the lead runner collapsed. Khalid's shot caught another. The remaining 2 reached the trucks, one firing wildly with the mounted gun, the other fumbling for the radio. The ground shook with the thump of heavy rounds as the machine gun chewed into the rocks. Robert dove behind cover, dust choking his lungs. Khalid fired again and again, forcing the gunner to duck. Then Robert saw him, Hakim himself sprinting for the lead truck, clutching his shoulders still wounded from earlier, but eyes blazing with fanatic resolve. His hand reached for the handset. Robert fired. The bullet slammed into Hakim's shoulder, spinning him sideways into the dust. The commander rolled, drawing a pistol with his good hand, teeth clenched, refusing to fall. Robert scrambled closer, firing bursts to keep the gunner down. Khalid's voice came harsh across the radio. Hakim is mine. Do not kill him. The old man emerged limping but determined, his Dragunov raised, his eyes burning with a fire carved from grief. He moved with the authority of judgment itself. Each step was heavy with the memory of his son and daughter-in-law. The battlefield grew silent for a moment, as if even the mountains held their breath. Hakim spat blood and glared up, recognition flashing in his eyes. The teacher's father, I should have finished you that day. His words hissed like poison. Khalid's finger trembled on the trigger, his rifle aimed at the man who had destroyed his life. Robert stood tense, every instinct telling him to intervene, knowing that one squeeze of the trigger would erase their fragile pact. Khalid's voice was low yet carried like thunder. My son believed in forgiveness. My daughter-in-law believed in mercy. They died for those beliefs. His hands tightened, his jaw quivered. Yet instead of firing, he lowered the rifle a fraction. Justice is greater than revenge. You will live to face judgment. Every day in prison you will remember that the teacher's father brought you here. Robert rushed forward, zip ties snapping around Hakim's wrists. The commander cursed and spat, but the fight had drained from his eyes. Around them the last echoes of battle faded. The survivors lay silent, the valley still. From the horizon came the sound of rotors, helicopters closing fast. Rescue had found them. Drawn by the beacon, Robert had managed to trigger on the captured radio. The Blackhawks descended, their blades whipping up storms of dust. Medics rushed out, lifting Michael onto a stretcher. Emma, guided by Jackson, stumbled towards safety. Martinez leaning on Thompson. Robert turned to look for Khalid, but the old man stood apart, his face unreadable, his eyes locked on the gray, bearded commander who was dragged toward the waiting bird. For a moment, their gazes held. A silent exchange of unfinished pain and reluctant closure. Then Khalid stepped back, fading into the rocks like the ghost he had always been. 6 months later, Robert sat in a sterile debriefing room, the white walls humming with the buzz of fluorescent lights. Intelligence officers demanded details, but he gave them only the official line. Mission accomplished with assistance from unidentified local asset. Rodriguez had survived his wounds and returned to command. The others decorated for their endurance under fire. Yet Robert carried the deeper truth in silence. He knew the legend of the Ghost of the Mountains would remain long after. Reports were filed away. Villagers spoke in hushed tones of an old man with a rifle who watched the passes. Some claimed to see him at dusk, a shadow among stones, guarding teachers, shielding children, ensuring that no one dared repeat the crimes of the past. Robert knew he would never meet him again, but he carried his lesson always, that true heroism did not wear uniforms or salute flags. It lived in ordinary people who refused to surrender to evil, in fathers who turned grief into justice, in teachers who dared to spread light where darkness reigned. As he closed the final page of his report, Robert wrote a single line for himself. Not for the officers or the record. The Ghost of the Mountains showed me that the most powerful warriors are not those who fight for nations, but those who fight for the right of families to live in peace. And with that thought, he left the room, carrying not just the memory of a battle survived, but the legend of a man who had chosen justice over vengeance, and in doing so had become eternal.